Hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are continuing on with The Man Who Laughs by Victor Hugo. We are starting with, let's see if I remember it all, Part 2, Book the Second. But first, reading updates. I am reading Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. I'm more than halfway through. I want it to be darker. I want it to be so much darker than what it is, and I feel like it could have gone that route, and it toyed with the idea of going dark, and then I was like, no, it might still, but I think the kind of dark isn't going to be the kind of dark that I want it to be. Okay, so Clara is an artificial friend, and she is in a store, and this girl, Josie, really wants to buy her. Josie is the daughter of a single parent. She has another parent, but we haven't really seen him in the picture for a while. And her sister died, and so she's just like sort of alone and lonely, and she does all of her schooling at home, and she's sick, and we don't know what she's sick with. And so she has this artificial friend, and I have just been waiting for the artificial friend to turn evil. I don't think that's going to happen, unfortunately. I was also waiting for like this weirdness with her mom to turn evil, and I don't think that's going to happen either. I think it's the old bait and switch where it's like we gonna get weird. No, we're gonna probably tie everything up in a nice bow, which I shouldn't sound so sad about that. It's very well written. It's very good. And then I also picked up volume 5 of Tokyo Ghoul. So, exciting stuff. I did already watch the anime a while ago, and then that's just what I do. I watch the anime and then it's like, well, I should read it, and then I read it, and then it's like, well, I should watch it, so then I'm probably going to watch it again. It's a vicious cycle that I have entered into. But I think that's all that I'm reading. I've actually been crafting a lot. Your girl is crafty. And I say that with so much confidence for somebody who struggles a lot. But I have made 2 hats. I've made 2 scrunchies. I'm about to start making a scarf. I'm just a machine. I'm not a machine at all. Most of it is me just unable to count and then having to rip things out and start over. Anyway, let's let's do this. Okay, so we left off. Yes, we were getting more acquainted with all of our key players in the aristocracy. Um, and they're all pretty terrible. They don't really do anything to better society. In fact, they actively make things worse for society, but somehow everybody just loves them. They get a ton of money every year for not really doing anything, mostly for starting wars and things like that. And the very last thing that we watched or that we read was our 2, what are they? What are they named? I don't even know. Can't tell you. Sorry, terrible with names. No, not Henry. That's a name that I just made up. Hosiana and Lord David. There we go. Hosiana and Lord David are at a boxing match, and they're watching these 2 people beat the crap out of each other, pretty brutally, all for entertainment purposes. And the fighters themselves are actually friends. They live together, and they're just like, they don't really want to fight each other. There's no animosity there. They just are doing it for money. And then at the very end, Hosiana is like, "Oh, my spleen," which we didn't know that she had spleen issues until this very moment. And then Lord David is like, "Hey, you know what'll help a spleen?" And she's like, "What?" And he says, "Gwynplaine." And she's like, "What?" And that's where it ends. So, We are 40% in. We are about to start book the second, and it is called Gwynplaine and the Dea. Shall we? Here we go. Chapter 1. Wherein we see the face of him of whom we have hitherto seen only the acts. Nature had been prodigal of her kindness to Gwynplaine. She had bestowed on him a mouth opening to his ears, ears folding over to his eyes, a shapeless nose to support the spectacles of the grimace maker, and a face that no one could look upon without laughing. We have just said that nature had loaded Gwynplaine with her gifts. But was it nature? Had she not been assisted? 2 slits for eyes, a hiatus for a mouth, a snub protuberance with 2 holes for nostrils, a flattened face, all having for the result an appearance of laughter. It is certain that nature never produces such perfection single-handed. But is laughter a synonym of joy? If, in the presence of this Mont Blanc, for he was one, the first impression of gaiety wore off, and the man were observed with attention, traces of art were to be recognized. Such a face could never have been created by chance. It must have resulted from intention. Such perfect completeness is not in nature. Man could do nothing to create beauty, but everything to produce ugliness. A Hottentot profile could be changed into a Roman outline, but out of a Grecian nose you may make a Kalmuk's. It only requires to obliterate the root of the nose and to flatten the nostrils. The dog Latin of the Middle Ages had a reason for its creation of the verb denussare. Had Gwynplaine when a child been so worthy of attention that his face had been subjected to transmutation? Why not? Needed there a greater motive than the speculation of his future exhibition? According to all appearance, industrious manipulators of children had worked upon his face. It seemed evident that a mysterious and probably occult science, which was to surgery what alchemy was to chemistry, had chiseled his flesh, evidently at a very tender age, and manufactured his countenance with premeditation. That science, clever with the knife, skilled in obtusions and ligatures, had enlarged the mouth, cut away the lips, laid bare the gums, distended the ears, cut the cartilages, displaced the eyelids and the cheeks, enlarged the zygomatic muscle, pressed the scars and cicatrices to a level, turned back the skin over the lesions whilst the face was thus stretched, from all which resulted that powerful and profound piece of sculpture, the mask, Gwynplaine. Man is not born thus. However it may have been, the manipulation of Gwynplaine had succeeded admirably. Gwynplaine was a gift of Providence to dispel the sadness of man. Of what Providence? Is there a Providence of demons as well as of God? We put the question without answering it. Gwynplaine was a mountebank. He showed himself on the platform. No such effect had ever before been produced. Hypochondriacs were cured by the sight of him alone. He was avoided by folks in mourning, because they were compelled to laugh when they saw him, without regard to their decent gravity. One day the executioner came, and Gwynplaine made him laugh. Everyone who saw Gwynplaine held his sides, he spoke, and they rolled on the ground. He was removed from sadness as is pole from pole, spleen at the one, Gwynplaine at the other. Thus he rose rapidly in the fair ground and at the crossroads to the very satisfactory renown of a horrible man. It was Gwynplaine's laugh which created the laughter of others, yet he did not laugh himself. His face laughed. His thoughts did not. The extraordinary face which chance or a special and weird industry had fashioned for him laughed alone. Gwynplaine had nothing to do with it. The outside did not depend on the interior. The laugh, which he had not placed himself on his brow, on his eyelids, on his mouth, he could not remove. It had been stamped forever on his face. It was automatic, and the more irresistible because it seemed petrified. No one could escape from this rictus. Two convulsions of the face are infectious, laughing and yawning. By virtue of the mysterious operation to which Gwynplaine had probably been subjected in his infancy, every part of his face contributed to that rictus. His whole physiognomy led to that result, as a wheel centers in the nave. All his emotions, whatever they might have been, augmented his strange face of joy, or, so to speak, more correctly, aggravated it. Any astonishment which might seize him, any suffering which he might feel, any anger which might take possession of him, any pity which might move him, would only increase his hilarity of his muscles. If he wept, he laughed. And whatever Gwynplaine was, whatever he wished to be, whatever he thought, the moment that he raised his head, the crowd, if crowd there was, had before them one impersonation, an overwhelming burst of laughter. It was like a head of Medusa, but Medusa hilarious. All feeling or thought in the mind of the spectator was suddenly put to flight by the unexpected apparition, and laughter was inevitable. Antique art formerly placed on the outsiders of the Greek theatre a joyous brazen face called comedy. It laughed and occasioned laughter, but remained pensive. All parody which borders on folly, all irony which borders on wisdom, were condensed and amalgamated in that face. The burden of care, of disillusion, anxiety, and grief were expressed in its impassive countenance, and resulted in a lugubrious sum of mirth. One corner of the mouth was raised in mockery of the human race, the other side in blasphemy of the gods. Men confronted that model of the ideal sarcasm and exemplification of the irony which each one possesses within him, and the crowd, continually renewed round its fixed laugh, died away with delight before its sepulchral immobility of mirth. One might almost have said that Gwynplaine was that dark, dead mask of ancient comedy adjusted to the body of a living man. That infernal head of implacable hilarity he supported on his neck. What a weight for the shoulders of a man! An everlasting laugh. An everlasting laugh. Let us understand each other. We will explain. The machinations believed the absolute occasionally gives way, and that God himself sometimes abdicates for a time. So also of the will. We do not admit that it can ever be utterly powerless. The whole of existence resembles a letter modified in the postscript. For Gwynplaine the postscript was this. By the force of his will, and by concentrating on his attention, and on condition that no emotion should come to distract and turn away the fixedness of his effort, he could manage to suspend the everlasting rictus of his face, and to throw over it a kind of tragic veil, and then the spectator laughed no longer. He shuddered. This exertion Gwynplaine scarcely ever made. It was a terrible effort, and an insupportable tension. Moreover, it happened that on the slightest distraction or the slightest emotion, the laugh, driven back for a moment, returned like a tide with an impulse which was irresistible in proportion to the force of the adverse emotion. With this exception, Gwynplaine's laugh was everlasting. On seeing Gwynplaine, all laughed. When they had laughed, they turned away their heads. Women especially shrank from him with horror. The man was frightful. The joyous convulsion of laughter was as a tribute paid. They submitted to it gladly, but almost mechanically. Besides, when once the novelty of the laugh had passed over, Gwynplaine was intolerable for a woman to see, and impossible to contemplate. But he was tall, well-made, and agile, and no way deformed, excepting in his face. This led to the presumption that Gwynplaine was rather a creation of art than a work of nature. Gwynplaine, beautiful in figure, had probably been beautiful in face. At his birth he had no doubt resembled other infants. They had left the body intact and retouched only the face. Gwynplaine had been made to order. At least, that was probable. They had left him his teeth. Teeth are necessary to a laugh. The death's head retains them. The operation performed on him must have been frightful. That he had no remembrance of it was no proof that it had not taken place. Surgical sculpture of the kind could never have succeeded except on a very young child, and consequently on one having little consciousness of what happened to him, and who might easily take a wound for a sickness. Besides, we must remember that they had in those times means of putting patients to sleep, and of suppressing all suffering. Only then it was called magic, while now it is called anesthesia. Besides this face, those who had brought him up had given him the resources of a gymnast and an athlete. His articulations, usefully displaced and fashioned to bending the wrong way, had received the education of a clown, and could, like the hinges of a door, move backwards and forwards. In appropriating him to the profession of mountebank, nothing had been neglected. His hair had been dyed with ochre once for all, a secret which has been rediscovered at the present day. Pretty women use it, and that which was formerly considered ugly is now considered an embellishment. Gwynplaine had yellow hair. His hair, having probably been dyed with some corrosive preparation, had left it woolly and rough to the touch. Its yellow bristles, rather a mane than a head of hair, covered and concealed a lofty brow, evidently made to contain thought. The operation, whatever it had been, which had deprived his features of harmony and put all their flesh into disorder, had no effect on the bony structure of his head. The facial angle was powerful and surprisingly grand. Behind his laugh there was a soul, dreaming, as all our souls dream. However, his laugh was to Gwynplaine quite a talent. He could do nothing with it, so he turned it to account. By means of it, he gained his living. Gwynplaine, as you have doubtless already guessed, was the child abandoned one winter evening on the coast of Portland, and received into the poor caravan at Weymouth. End of chapter 1. So, our little child is all grown up, and now we have a name for him, Gwynplaine, and wow. Wow, wow, wow. Okay, so people have a hard time not laughing when they see his face because it looks like he's laughing. And like laughing and yawning, it's just super contagious. But it's also horrific at the same time. There's mention that women have a really hard time looking at him for a long period of time, just because it is so deformed and so grotesque that they sort of shy away from it and hide themselves, shrink away. Uh, but they also say that it looks like this is the only thing that's been altered on Gwynplaine. Like, body is really strong, all of the limbs, like everything else looks exactly fine and almost beautiful. And so they're sure that as a child, Gwynplaine was definitely a beautiful baby, like had a really pretty face, all those things. And so it wasn't nature that did this, it was definitely people that did this, which we already know since we have the background of the Comprachicos, which, as a reminder, is a group of people who are from all different countries, all different beliefs, but hold the same ideal. And they disfigure children at a young age and mostly sell them to the aristocracy for entertainment purposes. But they don't steal the children, so they're morally good. They pay for them. Chapter 2. Dea. That boy was at this time a man. 15 years had elapsed. It was in 1705. Gwynplaine was in his 25th year. Ursus had kept the two children with him. They were a group of wanderers. Ursus and Homo had aged. Ursus had become quite bald. The wolf was growing gray. The age of wolves is not ascertained like that of dogs. According to Molière, there are wolves which live to 80, amongst others the little capara and the rank wolf, the Canis nubilis of Say. The little girl found on the dead woman was now a tall creature of 16, with brown hair, slight, fragile, almost trembling from delicacy, and almost inspiring fear lest she should break. Admiringly beautiful, her eyes full of light, yet blind. That fatal winter night which threw down the beggar woman and her infant in the snow had struck a double blow. It had killed the mother and blinded the child. Gutta Serena had forever paralyzed the eyes of the girl, now become woman in her turn. On her face, through which the light of day never passed, the depressed corners of the mouth indicated the bitterness of the privation. Her eyes, large and clear, had a strange quality. Extinguished forever to her, to others, they were brilliant. They were mysterious torches lighting only the outside. They gave light, but possessed it not. These sightless eyes were resplendent. A captive of shadow, she lighted up the dull place she inhabited. From the depth of her incurable darkness, from behind the black wall called blindness, she flung her rays. She saw not the sun without, but her soul was perceptible from within. In her dead look there was a celestial earnestness. She was the night, and from the irredeemable darkness with which she was amalgamated, she came out a star. Ursus, with his mania for Latin names, had christened. There we go. Christened. Oh my gosh, why was that so hard for me? Ursus, with his mania for Latin names, had christened her Dea. He had taken his wolf into consultation. He had said to him, "You represent man, I represent the beasts. You are of the lower world, this little one shall represent the world on high. Such feebleness is all-powerful. In this manner the universe shall be complete in our hut in its three orders, human, animal, and divine." The wolf made no objection. Therefore the foundling was called Dea. As to Gwynplaine, Ursus had not had the trouble of inventing a name for him. The morning of the day on which he had realized the disfigurement of the little boy and the blindness of the infant, he had asked him, "Boy, what is your name?" And the boy had answered, "They call me Gwynplaine." "Be Gwynplaine, then," said Ursus. Dea assisted Gwynplaine in his performances. If human misery could be summed up, it might have been summed up in Gwynplaine and Dea. Each seemed born in a compartment of the sepulchre. Gwynplaine in the horrible, Dea in the darkness. Their existences were shadowed by two different kinds of darkness, taken from the two formidable sides of night. Dea had that shadow in her. Gwynplaine had it on him. There was a phantom in Dea, a spectre in Gwynplaine. Dea was sunk in the mournful, Gwynplaine in something worse. There was for Gwynplaine, who could see, a heart-rending possibility that existed not for Dea, who was blind. He could compare himself with other men. Now, in a situation such as that of Gwynplaine, admitting that he should seek to examine it, to compare himself with others was to understand himself no more. To have, like Dea, empty sight from which the world is absent, is a supreme distress, yet less than to be an enigma to oneself. To feel that something is wanting here as well, and that something, oneself. To see the universe and not to see oneself. Dea had a veil over her, the night. Gwynplaine a mask, his face. Inexpressible fact, it was by his own flesh that Gwynplaine was masked. What his visage had been, he knew not. His face had vanished. They had affixed to him a false self. He had for a face a disappearance. His head lived, his face was dead. He never remembered to have seen it. Mankind was for Gwynplaine, as for Dea, an exterior fact. It was far off. She was alone. He was alone. The isolation of Dea was funeral. She saw nothing. That of Gwynplaine, sinister. He saw all things. For Dea, creation never passed the bounds of touch and hearing. Reality was bounded, limited, short, immediately lost. Nothing was infinite to her but darkness. For Gwynplaine to live was to have the crowd forever before him and outside him. Dea was the prescribed from light, Gwynplaine the band of life. They were beyond the pale of hope and had reached the depth of possible calamity. They had sunk into it, both of them. An observer who had watched them would have felt his reverie melt into immeasurable pity. What must they not have suffered? The decree of misfortune weighed visibly on these human creatures, and never had fate encompassed two beings who had done nothing to deserve it, and more clearly turned destiny into torture, and life into hell. They were in a paradise. They were in love. Gwynplaine adored Dea. Dea idolized Gwynplaine. "How beautiful you are," she would say to him. End of chapter 2. All right, chapter 2, all about Dea, the little bibith that Gwynplaine picked up. And she is blind. She was blinded by the horrible conditions that killed her mother. And she is named after Ursus. Ursus named her of the divine, which I love that. And she's just helping Gwynplaine, and they have a bond which is very deep-seated, not only because probably the trauma that they have gone through, but also maybe because of the trauma they've gone through. And just their perspective on life is so different from a lot of other people. Neither of them have earned or gained the life that they have. It was both decided for them from outside sources. So, I don't see anything going wrong with that at all. Totally not. We'll see. Okay, chapter 3, Oculos non habet et vide. Only one woman on earth saw Gwynplaine. It was the blind girl. She had learned what Gwynplaine had done for her from Ursus, to whom he had related his rough journey from Portland to Weymouth, and the many sufferings which he had endured when deserted by the gang. She knew that when an infant dying upon her dead mother, suckling a corpse, a being scarcely bigger than herself had taken her up, that this being, exiled and, as it were, buried under the refusal of the universe to aid him, had heard her cry, that all the world being deaf to him, he had not been deaf to her, that the child, alone, weak, cast off without resting place here below, dragging himself over the waste, exhausted by fatigue, crushed, had accepted from the hands of night a burden, another child. That he, who had nothing to expect in that obscure distribution which we call fate, had charged himself with a destiny, that naked, in anguish and distress, he had made himself a providence. That when heaven had closed he had opened his heart, that, himself lost, he had saved, that having neither roof, tree, nor shelter, he had been an asylum, that he had made himself mother and nurse, that he who was alone in the world had responded to desertion by adoption, that lost in the darkness he had given an example, that as if not already sufficiently burdened, he had added to his load another's misery, that in this world, which seemed to contain nothing for him, he had found a duty, that where everyone else would have hesitated, he had advanced, that where everyone else would have drawn back, he consented, that he had put his hand into the jaws of the grave and drawn out her Dea, that, himself half naked, he had given her his rags because she was cold, that famished, he had thought of giving her food and drink, that for one little creature, another little creature had combated death, that he had fought it under every form, under the form of winter and snow, under the form of solitude, under the form of terror, under the form of cold, hunger, and thirst, under the form of whirlwind, and that for her, Dea, this Titan of 10, had given battle to the immensity of night. She knew that as a child he had done this, and that now as a man he was strength to her weakness, riches to her poverty, healing to her sickness, and sight to her blindness. Through the mist of the unknown by which she felt herself encompassed, she distinguished clearly his devotion, his abnegation, his courage. Heroism in immaterial region has an outline. She distinguished this sublime outline in the inexpressible abstraction in which thought lives unlighted by the sun. Dea perceived this mysterious lineament of virtue in the surrounding of dark things put in motion, which was the only impression made on her by reality, in the uneasy stagnation of a creature, always passive, yet always on the watch for possible evil, in the sensation of being ever defenseless, which is the life of the blind. She felt Gwynplaine above her. Gwynplaine, never cold, never absent, never obscured. Gwynplaine sympathetic, helpful, and sweet-tempered. Dea quivered with certainty and gratitude. Her anxiety changed into ecstasy, and with her shadowy eyes she contemplated on the zenith from the depth of her abyss the rich light of his goodness. In the ideal, kindness is the sun, and Gwynplaine dazzled Dea. To the crowd which has too many heads to have a thought, and too many eyes to have a sight, to the crowd who, superficial themselves, judge only on the surface, Gwynplaine was a clown, a Merry Andrew, a mountebank, a creature grotesque, a little more and a little less than a beast. The crowd knew only the face. For Dea, Gwynplaine was the savior who had gathered her into her arms in the tomb and borne her out of it, the consoler who had made life tolerable, the liberator whose hand, holding her own, guided her through that labyrinth called blindness. Gwynplaine was her brother, friend, guide, support, the personification of heavenly power, the husband, winged and resplendent. Where the multitude saw the monster, Dea recognized the archangel. It was that Dea, blind, perceived his soul. End of chapter 3. So we get more of an insight into their relationship. And Dea is just forever grateful to Gwynplaine for having scooped her up, and fully notices and what am I trying to say? What's that word? Acknowledges that Gwynplaine could have just left her. Like, he was 10, had rags on, was starving, had nothing to drink, no shelter. He could have easily have left her there to die, and he didn't. He picked her up, and she's forever grateful for it. And so he really balances her out, where, you know, she sees weakness in herself, she sees strength in Gwynplaine, and she is the only one who actually sees him for him. She's able to see beyond his face, for lack of a better word. Chapter 4. Well-matched lovers. Ursus, being a philosopher, understood. He approved of the fascination of Dea. He said, "The blind see the invisible." He said, "Conscience is vision." Then, looking at Gwynplaine, he murmured, "Semi-monster, but semi-god, demigod." Gwynplaine, on the other hand, was madly in love with Dea. There is the invisible eye, the spirit, the visible eye, the pupil. He saw her with the visible eye. Dea was dazzled by the ideal, Gwynplaine by the real. Gwynplaine was not ugly. He was frightful. He saw his contrast before him. In proportion as he was terrible, Dea was sweet. He was horror, she was grace. Dea was his dream. She seemed a vision scarcely embodied. There was in her whole person, in her Grecian form, in her fine and supple figure, swaying like a reed, in her shoulders on which might have been invisible wings, in the modest curves which indicated her sex, to the soul rather than to the senses, in her fairness, which amounted almost to transparency, in the august and reserved serenity of her look, divinely shut out from earth, in the sacred innocence of her smile. She was almost an angel, and yet just a woman. Gwynplaine, we have said, compared himself and compared Dea. His existence, such as it was the result of a double and unheard of choice. It was the point of intersection of two rays, one from below and one from above, a black and a white ray. To the same crumb, perhaps pecked at once by the beak of evil and good, one gave the bite, the other the kiss. Gwynplaine was this crumb, an atom wounded and caressed. Gwynplaine was the product of fatality combined with providence. Misfortune had placed its finger on him, happiness as well. Two extreme destinies composed his strange lot. He had on him an anathema and a benediction. He was the elect, cursed. Who was he? He knew not. When he looked at himself, he saw one he knew not, but this unknown was a monster. Gwynplaine lived as it were beheaded, with a face which did not belong to him. This face was frightful, so frightful that it was absurd. It caused as much fear as laughter. It was a hell-concocted absurdity. It was the shipwreck of a human face into the mask of an animal. Never had been seen so total an eclipse of humanity in a human face. Never parody more complete. Never had apparition more frightful grinned in nightmare. Never had everything repulsive to woman been more hideously amalgamated in a man. The unfortunate heart, masked and calumniated by the face, seemed forever condemned to solitude under it, as under a tombstone. Yet no. Where unknown malice had done its worst, invisible goodness had lent its aid. and the poor fallen one, suddenly raised up by the side of the repulsive, it had placed the attractive. On the barren shoal it had set the lodestone. It had caused a soul to fly with swift wings towards the deserted one. It had sent the dove to console the creature whom the thunderbolt had overwhelmed, and had made beauty adore deformity. For this to be possible, it was necessary that beauty should not see the disfigurement. For this good fortune, misfortune was required. Providence had made Dea blind. Gwynplaine vaguely felt himself the object of a redemption. Why had he been persecuted? He knew not. Why redeemed? He knew not. All he knew was that a halo had encircled his brand. When Gwynplaine had been old enough to understand, Ursus had read and explained to him the text of Dr. Conquest de Denasantes, and in another folio Hugo Placone the passage Naves heavens mutilas, but Ursus had prudently abstained from hypotheses, and had been reserved in his opinion of what it might mean. Suppositions were possible. The probability of violence inflicted on Gwynplaine when an infant was hinted at, but for Gwynplaine the result was the only evidence. His destiny was to live under a stigma. Why this stigma? There was no answer. Silence and solitude were around Gwynplaine. All was uncertain in the conjectures which could be fitted to the tragical reality. Accepting the terrible fact, nothing was certain. In his discouragement, Dea intervened, a sort of celestial interposition between him and despair. He perceived, melted and inspirited by the sweetness of the beautiful girl who turned to him, that, horrible as he was, a beautified wonder affected his monstrous visage. Having been fashioned to create dread, he was the object of a miraculous exception. That it was admired and adored in the ideal by the light, and, monster that he was, he felt himself the contemplation of a star. Gwynplaine and Dea were united, and these two suffering hearts adored each other. One nest and two birds, that was their story. They had begun to feel a universal law, to please, to seek, and to find each other. Thus hatred had made a mistake. The persecutors of Gwynplaine, whoever they might have been, the deadly enigma from wherever it came, had missed their aim. They had intended it to drive him to desperation. They had succeeded in driving him into enchantment. They had affianced him beforehand to a healing wound. They had predestined him for consolation by an affliction. The pincers of the executioner had softly changed into the delicately molded hand of a girl. Gwynplaine was horrible, artificially horrible, made horrible by the hand of man. They had hoped to exile him forever, first from his family, if his family existed, and then from humanity. When an infant, they had made him a ruin. Of this ruin nature had repossessed herself, as she does of all ruins. This solitude nature had consoled, as she consoles all solitudes. Nature comes to the succor of the deserted. Where all is lacking, she gives back her whole self. She flourishes and grows green amid ruins. She has ivy for the stones and love for man. Profound generosity of the shadows. That was the end of chapter 4. BT dubs. And we're just getting more and more comparisons between Dea and Gwynplaine, and also Gwynplaine doesn't really know like who he is or where he comes from, but at the same time knows that like whoever did this to him was trying to isolate him from his family and from humanity, and He was just sort of enraptured by nature and has just come to find Dea. And through Dea, he's able to find purpose and joy and light in life, which is pretty cool. Chapter 5. The blue sky through the black cloud. Thus lived these unfortunate creatures together. Dea relying, Gwynplaine accepted. These orphans were all in all to each other, the feeble and the deformed. The widowed were betrothed. An inexpressible thanksgiving arose out of their distress. They were grateful. To whom? To the obscure immensity. Be grateful in your own hearts. That suffices. Thanksgiving has wings and flies to its right destination. Your prayer knows its way better than you can. How many men have believed that they prayed to Jupiter when they prayed to Jehovah? How many believers in amulets are listened to by the Almighty? How many atheists there are who know not that, in the simple fact of being good and sad, they pray to God. Gwynplaine and Dea were grateful. Deformity is expulsion. Blindness is a precipice. The expelled one had been adopted. The precipice was habitable. Gwynplaine had seen a bright light descending on him, in an arrangement of destiny which seemed to put, in the perspective of a dream, a white cloud of beauty having the form of a woman, a radiant vision in which there was a heart, and the phantom, almost a cloud and yet a woman, clasped him, and the apparition embraced him, and the heart desired him. Gwynplaine was no longer deformed. He was beloved. The rose demanded the caterpillar in marriage, feeling that within the caterpillar there was a divine butterfly. Gwynplaine, the rejected, was chosen. To have one's desire is everything. Gwynplaine had his, Dea hers. The abjection of the disfigured man was exalted and dilated into intoxication, into delight, into belief, and a hand was stretched out towards the melancholy hesitation of the blind girl to guide her in her darkness. It was the penetration of two misfortunes into the ideal which absorbed them. The rejected found a refuge in each other. Two blanks combining filled each other up. They held together by what they lacked. In that in which one was poor, the other was rich. The misfortune of the one made the treasure of the other. Had Dea not been blind, would she have chosen Gwynplaine? Had Gwynplaine not been disfigured, would he have preferred Dea? She would probably have rejected the deformed, as he would have passed by the infirm. What happiness for Dea that Gwynplaine was hideous! What good fortune for Gwynplaine that Dea was blind! Apart from their providential matching, they were impossible to each other. A mighty want of each other was at the bottom of their loves. Gwynplaine saved Dea. Dea saved Gwynplaine. Opposition of misery produced adherence. It was the embrace of those swallowed in the abyss, none closer, none more hopeless, none more exquisite. Gwynplaine had a thought. What should I be without her? Dea had a thought. What should I be without him? The exile of each made a country for both. The two incurable fatalities, the stigmata of Gwynplaine and the blindness of Dea, joined them together in contentment. They sufficed to each other. They imagined nothing beyond each other. To speak to one another was a delight, to approach was beatitude. By force of reciprocal intuition they became united in the same reverie, and thought the same thoughts. In Gwynplaine's tread, Dea believed that she heard the step of one deified. They tightened their mutual grasp in a sort of sidereal chiaroscuro, full of perfumes, of gleams, of music, of the luminous architecture of dreams. They belonged to each other. They knew themselves to be forever united in the same joy and the same ecstasy. And nothing could be stranger than this construction of an Eden by two of the damned. They were inexpressibly happy. In their hell they had created heaven. Such was thy power, O love. Dea heard Gwynplaine's laugh. Gwynplaine saw Dea's smile. Thus ideal felicity was found, the perfect joy of life was realized, the mysterious problem of happiness was solved, and by whom? By two outcasts. For Gwynplaine, Dea was splendor. For Dea, Gwynplaine was presence. Presence is that profound mystery which renders the invisible world divine, and from which results that other mystery, confidence. In religions, this is the only thing which is irreducible, but this irreducible thing suffices. The great motive power is not seen, it is felt. Gwynplaine was the religion of Dea. Sometimes, lost in her sense of love towards him, she knelt, like a beautiful priestess before a gnome in a pagoda, made happy by her adoration. Imagine to yourself an abyss, and in its center an oasis of light, and in this oasis two creatures shut out of life, dazzling each other. No purity could be compared to their loves. Dea was ignorant what a kiss might be, though perhaps she desired it, because blindness, especially in a woman, has its dreams, and though trembling at the approaches of the unknown, does not fear them all. As to Gwynplaine, his sensitive youth made him pensive. The more delirious he felt, the more timid he became. He might have dared anything with this companion of his early youth, with this creature as innocent of fault as of the light, with this blind girl who saw but one thing, that she adored him. But he would have thought it a theft to take what she might have given. So he resigned himself with a melancholy satisfaction to love angelically, and the conviction of his deformity resolved itself into a proud purity. These happy creatures dwelt in the ideal. They were spouses in it, at distances as opposite as the spheres. They exchanged in its firmament the deep effluvium which is in affinity attraction, and on earth the sexes. Their kisses were the kisses of souls. They had always lived a common life. They knew themselves only in each other's society. The infancy of Dea had coincided with the youth of Gwynplaine. They had grown up side by side. For a long time they had slept in the same bed, for the hut was not a large bedchamber. They lay on the chest, Ursus on the floor. That was the arrangement. One fine day, whilst Dea was still very little, Gwynplaine felt himself grow up, and it was in the youth that shame arose. He said to Ursus, "I will also sleep on the floor." And at night he stretched himself with the old man on the bearskin. Then Dea wept. She cried for her bedfellow, but Gwynplaine, become restless because he had begun to love, decided to remain where he was. From that time he always slept by the side of Ursus on the planks. In the summer, when the nights were fine, he slept outside with the wolf. When 13, Dea had not yet become resigned to the arrangement. Often in the evening she said, "Gwynplaine, come close to me. That will put me to sleep." A man lying by her side was a necessity to her innocent slumbers. Nudity is to see that one is naked. She ignored nudity. It was the ingenuousness of Arcadia. Dea, untaught, made Gwynplaine wild. Sometimes it happened that Dea, when almost reaching youth, combed her long hairs as she sat on her bed. Her chemise unfastened and falling off revealed indications of a feminine outline and a vague commencement of Eve, and would call to Gwynplaine. Gwynplaine blushed, lowered his eyes, and knew not what to do in presence of this innocent creature. Stammering, he turned his head, feared, and fled. The Daphnis of darkness took flight before the Chloe of shadow. Such was the ideal, blooming in a tragedy. Ursus said to them, "Old brutes, adore each other." End of chapter 5. So, Gwynplaine and Dea. So Gwynplaine loves Dea. We're still continuing to get the, the yin to the yang type of thing, and how they're both extreme outcasts amongst their family because they don't really have family. They have Ursus, which is like almost an adopted family, and humanity. And so they are finding light in each other. And there came a time when Gwynplaine, started growing up and he realized that, oh, I kind of like love Dea, and it's weird that I'm, sleeping so close to her. So he moved to the floor with Ursus, and Dea is not really getting it, and it's just like, why? What are you doing? Like, come sleep, next to me like you always do. And he's like, no, I'm not gonna do that. So, there's that. All right. Chapter 6. Ursus as tutor and Ursus as guardian. Ursus added, "Some of these tricks I will play them, a nasty trick. I will marry them." Ursus taught Gwynplaine the theory of love. He said to him, "Do you know how the Almighty lights the fire called love? He places the woman underneath, the devil between, and the man on top, a match, that is to say, a look, and behold, it is all on fire." "A look is unnecessary," answered Gwynplaine, thinking of Dea. And Ursus replied, "Do souls require mortal eyes to see each other?" Ursus was a good fellow at times. Gwynplaine, sometimes madly in love with Dea, became melancholy, and made use of the presence of Ursus as a guard on himself. One day Ursus said to him, "Bah! Do not put yourself out. When in love... Do not put yourself out when in love." There we go. "But the eagle conceals himself," replied Gwynplaine. At other times Ursus would say to himself apart, "It is wise to put spokes in the wheels of the car. They love each other too much. This may have its disadvantages. Let us avoid a fire. Let us moderate these hearts." Then Ursus had recourse to warnings of this nature, speaking to Gwynplaine when Dea slept, and to Dea when Gwynplaine's back was turned. "Dea, you must not be so fond of Gwynplaine. To live in the life of another is perilous. Egoism is a good root of happiness. Men escape from women, and then Gwynplaine might end by becoming infatuated with you. His success is so great, you have no idea how great his success is." "Gwynplaine, disportions are no good. So much ugliness on one side and so much beauty on the other ought to compel reflection. Temper your ardor, my boy. Do not become too enthusiastic about Dea. Do you seriously consider that you are made for her? Just think of your deformity and her perfection. See the distance between you and herself. She has everything, this Dea. What a white skin, what hair, lips like strawberries, and her foot! Her hand! Those shoulders with their exquisite curve! Her expression is sublime. She walks diffusing light, and in speaking, the grave tone of her voice is charming. But for all this, to think that she is a woman! She would not be such a fool as to be an angel. She is absolute beauty. Repeat all this to yourself, to calm your ardor." These speeches redoubled the love of Gwynplaine and Dea, and Ursus was astonished at his want of success, just as one who should say, "It is singular that with all the oil I throw on fire, I cannot extinguish it. Did he, then, desire to extinguish their love, or to cool it, even? Certainly not. He would have been well punished had he succeeded. At the bottom of his heart, this love, which was flame for them and warmth for him, was his delight. But it is natural to grate a little against that which charms us. Men call it wisdom. Ursus had been, in his relations with Gwynplaine and Dea, almost a father and a mother. Grumbling all the while he had brought them up, grumbling all the while he had nourished them. His adoption of them had made the hut roll more heavily, and he had been oftener compelled to harness himself by the wolf's side to help to draw it. We may observe, however, that after the first few years, when Gwynplaine was nearly grown up, and Ursus had grown quite old, Gwynplaine had taken his turn and drawn Ursus. Ursus, seeing that Gwynplaine was becoming a man, had cast the horoscope of his deformity. "It has made your fortune," he had told him. This family of an old man and 2 children with a wolf had become, as they wandered, a group more and more intimately united. Their errant life had not hindered education. "To wander is to grow," Ursus said. Gwynplaine was evidently made to exhibit at fairs. Ursus had cultivated in him feats of dexterity, and had encrusted him as much as possible with all he himself possessed of science and wisdom. Ursus, contemplating the perplexing mask of Gwynplaine's face, often growled. "He has begun well." It was for this reason that he had perfected him with every ornament of philosophy and wisdom. He repeated constantly to Gwynplaine, "Be a philosopher. To be wise is to be invulnerable. You see what I am. I have never shed a tear. This is the result of my wisdom. Do you think that occasion for tears has been wanting, had I felt disposed to weep?" Ursus, in one of his monologues in the hearing of the wolf, said, "I have taught Gwynplaine everything, Latin included. I have taught Dea nothing, music included." He had taught them both to sing. He had himself a pretty talent for playing on the oaten reed, a little flute of that period. He played on it agreeably, as also on a chiffony, a sort of beggar's hurdy-gurdy, mentioned in the Chronicle of Bertrand as the truant instrument which started the symphony. These instruments attracted the crowd. Ursus would show them the chiffony and say, "It is called organistrum in Latin." He had taught Dea and Gwynplaine to sing, according to the method of Orpheus and Egid Bencois. Frequently he interrupted the lessons with cries of enthusiasm, such as, "Orpheus, musician of Greece!" Bencois, musician of Picardy. These branches of careful culture did not occupy the children so as to prevent their adoring each other. They had mingled their hearts together as they grew up, as 2 saplings planted near mingle their branches as they become trees. "No matter," said Ursus. "I will marry them." Then he grumbled to himself. "They are quite tiresome with their love." The past, their little past at least, had no existence for Dea and Gwynplaine. They knew only that Ursus had told them of it. They called Ursus father. The only remembrance which Gwynplaine had of his infancy was as of a passage of demons over his cradle. He had an impression of having been trodden in the darkness under deformed feet. Was this intentional or not? He was ignorant on this point. That which he remembered clearly and to the slightest detail were his tragical adventures when deserted at Portland. The finding of Dea made that dismal night a radiant date for him. The memory of Dea, even more than that of Gwynplaine, was lost in clouds. In so young a child, all remembrance melts away. She recollected her mother as something cold. Had she ever seen the sun? Perhaps so. She made efforts to pierce into the blank which was her past life. The sun. What was it? She had some vague memory of a thing luminous and warm, of which Gwynplaine had taken the place. They spoke to each other in low tones. It is certain that cooing is the most important thing in the world. Dea often said to Gwynplaine, "Light means that you are speaking." Once, no longer containing himself, as he saw through a muslin sleeve the arm of Dea, Gwynplaine brushed its transparency with his lips. Ideal kiss of a deformed mouth. Dea felt a deep delight. She blushed like a rose. This kiss from a monster made Aurora gleam on that beautiful brow full of night. However, Gwynplaine sighed with a kind of terror, and as the neckerchief of Dea gaped, he could not refrain from looking at the whiteness visible through that glimpse of paradise. Dea pulled up her sleeve and stretched towards Gwynplaine her naked arm. Again! Gwynplaine fled. The next day the game was renewed with variations. It was a heavenly subsistence into that sweet abyss called love. At such things heaven smiles philosophically. End of chapter 6. Okay, so at the very beginning of this book, of this book in this part of this book, it was a 15-year gap from when we first met them, and now we're sort of going back and getting little slices of their relationship, slices of their life, that sort of thing. And so we have a glimpse, a little peek into the Ursus relationship. And so Ursus is basically like a father, and in fact they do call him father, and he taught both of them how to sing and philosophy and music and all of these other things, Latin. And yeah, so just because they didn't go to like a schoolhouse does not mean that their education was deterred. And we're getting little snippets into the like forbidden love between Gwynplaine and Dea as well. Chapter 7. Blindness gives lessons in clairvoyance. At times Gwynplaine reproached himself. He made his happiness a case of conscience. He fancied that to allow a woman who could not see him to love him was to deceive her. What would she have said could she have suddenly obtained her sight? How she would have felt repulsed by what had previously attracted her. How she would have recoiled from her frightful lodestone. What a cry! What covering of her face! What a flight! A bitter scruple harassed him. He told himself that such a monster as he had no right to love. He was a hydra, idolized by a star. It was his duty to enlighten the blind star. One day he said to Dea, "You know that I am very ugly." "I know that you are sublime," she answered. He resumed, "When you hear all the world laugh, they laugh at me because I am horrible." "I love you," said Dea. After a silence, she added, "I was in death. You brought me to life. When you are here, heaven is by my side. Give me your hand, that I may touch heaven." Their hands met and grasped each other. They spoke no more, but were silent in the plenitude of love. Ursus, who was crabbed, had overheard this. The next day, when the three were together, he said, "For that matter, Dea is ugly also." The word produced no effect. Dea and Gwynplaine were not listening. Absorbed in each other, they rarely heeded such exclamations of Ursus. Their depth was a dead loss. This time, however, the precaution of Ursus, "Dea is also ugly," indicated in this learned man a certain knowledge of women. It is certain that Gwynplaine, in his loyalty, had been guilty of an imprudence. To have said, "I am ugly," to any other blind girl than Dea might have been dangerous. To be blind and in love is to be twofold blind. In such a situation, dreams are dreamt. Illusion is the food of dreams. Take illusion from love, and you take from it its ailment. Its aliment, not its ailment. Oops. It is compounded of every enthusiasm, of both physical and moral admiration. Moreover, you should never tell a woman a word difficult to understand. She will dream about it, and she often dreams falsely. An enigma in a reverie spoils it. The shock caused by the fall of a careless word displaces that against which it strikes. At times it happens without our knowing why, that because we have received the obscure blow of a chance word, the heart empties itself insensibly of love. He who loves perceives a decline in his happiness. Nothing is to be feared more than this slow exudation from the fissure in the vase. Happily, Dea was not formed of such clay. The stuff of which other women are made had not been used in her construction. She had a rare nature. The frame, but not the heart, was fragile. A divine perseverance in love was in the heart of her being. The whole disturbance which the word used by Gwynplaine had produced in her ended in her saying one day, "To be ugly, what is it? It is to do wrong. Gwynplaine only does good. He is handsome." Then, under the form of interrogation so familiar to children and to the blind, she resumed, "To see? What is it that you call seeing? For my own part, I cannot see. I know. It seems that to see means to hide." "What do you mean?" asked Gwynplaine. Dea answered, "To see is a thing which conceals the truth." "No," said Gwynplaine. "But yes," replied Dea, "since you say you are ugly." She reflected a moment and then said, "Storyteller." Gwynplaine felt the joy of having confessed and of not being believed. Both his conscience and his love were consoled. Thus they had reached Dea 16, Gwynplaine nearly 25. They were not, as it would now be expressed, more advanced than the first day. Less even, for it may be remembered that on their wedding night she was 9 months and he was 10 years old. A sort of holy childhood had continued in their love. Thus it sometimes happens that the belated nightingale prolongs her nocturnal song till dawn. Their caresses went no further than pressing hands or lips brushing a naked arm. Soft, half-articulate whispers sufficed them. 24 and 16. So it happened that Ursus, who did not lose sight of the ill turn he intended to do them, said, "One of these days you must choose a religion." "Wherefore?" inquired Gwynplaine. "That you may marry." "That is already done," said Dea. Dea did not understand that they could be more man and wife than they were already. At bottom, this chimerical and virginal content, this innocent union of souls, this celibacy taken for marriage, was not displeasing to Ursus. Besides, were they not already married? If the indissoluble existed anywhere, was it not in their union? Gwynplaine and Dea. They were creatures worthy of the love they mutually felt, flung by misfortune into each other's arms. And as if there were not enough in this first link, love had on misfortune, and had attached them, united and bound them together. What power could ever break that iron chain, bound with knots of flowers? They were indeed bound together. Dea had beauty, Gwynplaine had sight. Each brought a dowry. They were more than coupled, they were paired, separated solely by the sacred interposition of innocence. Though dream as Gwynplaine would, however, and absorb all meaner passions as he could in the contemplation of Dea and before the tribunal of conscience, he was a man. Fatal laws was not to be eluded. He underwent, like everything else in nature, the obscure fermentations willed by the Creator. At times, therefore, he looked at the women who were in the crowd, but he immediately felt that the look was a sin, and hastened to retire, repentant, into his own soul. Let us add that he met with no encouragement. On the face of every woman who looked upon him he saw aversion, antipathy, repugnance, and rejection. It was clear that no other than Dea was possible for him. This aided his repentance. End of chapter 7. So we're back at current day, and Ursus is like, all right, you two, pick a religion, let's get you married. And Dea's like, okay, but like, aren't we already married? Like, what more do we need? And Ursus is like, huh. Which is like such an innocent like thing to say. Like, we're already like living together. We love each other. We've been together since like she was 9 months old, which is insane. Yeah. Chapter 8. Not only happiness, but prosperity. What true things are told in stories? The burnt scar of the invisible fiend who has touched you is remorse for a wicked thought. In Gwynplaine evil thoughts never ripened, and he had therefore no remorse. Sometimes he felt regret. Vague mists of conscience. What was this? Nothing. Their happiness was complete, so complete that they were no longer even poor. From 1680 to 1704 a great change had taken place. It happened, sometimes, in the year 1704, that as night fell on some little village on the coast, a great, heavy van, drawn by a pair of stout horses, made its entry. It was like the shell of a vessel reversed, the keel for a roof, the deck for a floor, placed on 4 wheels. The wheels were all the same size and high as wagon wheels. Wheels, pole, and van were all painted green, with a rhythmical gradation of shades which ranged from bottle green for the wheels to apple green for the roofing. This green color had succeeded in drawing attention to the carriage, which was known in all the fairgrounds as the Green Box. The Green Box had but 2 windows, one at each extremity, and at the back a door with steps to let down. On the roof, from a tube painted green like the rest, smoke arose. This moving house was always varnished and washed afresh. In front, on a ledge fastened to the van, with the window for a door, behind the horses, and by the side of an old man who held the reins and directed the team, 2 gypsy women, dressed as goddesses, sounded their trumpets. The astonishment with which the villagers regarded this machine was overwhelming. This was the old establishment of Ursus, its proportions augmented by success, and improved from a wretched booth into a theatre. A kind of animal, between dog and wolf, was chained under the van. This was Homo. The old coachman who drove the horses was the philosopher himself. Whence came this improvement from the miserable hut to the Olympic caravan? From this, Gwynplaine had become famous. It was with a correct scent of what would succeed amongst men that Ursus had said to Gwynplaine, "They made your fortune." Ursus, it may be remembered, had made Gwynplaine his pupil. Unknown people had worked under his face. He, on the other hand, had worked on his mind. And behind this well-executed mask he had placed all that he could of thought. As soon as the growth of the child had rendered him fitted for it, he had brought him out on the stage. That is, he had produced him in front of the van. The effect of his appearance had been surprising. The passers-by were immediately struck with wonder. Never had anything been seen to be compared to this extraordinary mimic of laughter. They were ignorant how the miracle of infectious hilarity had been obtained. Some believed it to be natural, others declared it to be artificial. And as conjecture was added to reality, everywhere, at every crossroad on the journey, in all the grounds of fairs and fêtes, the crowd ran after Gwynplaine. Thanks to this great attraction, there had come into the poor purse of the wandering group first a rain of farthings, then of heavy pennies, and finally of shillings. The curiosity of one place exhausted, they passed on to the other. Rolling does not enrich a stone, but it enriches a caravan. The year by year, from city to city, with the increased growth of Gwynplaine's person and of his ugliness, the fortune predicted by Ursus had come. "What a good turn they did you there! What a good turn they did you there, my boy!" said Ursus. This fortune had allowed Ursus, who was the administrator of Gwynplaine's success, to have the chariot of his dreams constructed. That is to say, a caravan large enough to carry a theatre and to sow science and art in the highways. Moreover, Ursus had been able to add to the group composed of himself, the wolf, Gwynplaine, and Dea, 2 horses and 2 women, who were the goddesses of the troupe, as we have just said, and its servants. A mythological frontispiece was, in those days, of service to a caravan of mountebanks. "We are a wandering temple," said Ursus. These 2 gypsies, picked up by the philosopher from amongst the vagabondage of cities and suburbs, were ugly and young, and were called, by order of Ursus, the one Phoebe, and the other Venus. For these read Phoebe, Fibi, and Venos, that we may conform to English pronunciation. Phoebe cooked, Venus scrubbed the temple. Moreover, on days of performance they dressed Dea. Mountebanks have their public life as well as princes, and on these occasions Dea was arranged, like Phoebe and Venos, in a Florentine petticoat of flowered stuff, and a woman's jacket without sleeves, leaving the arms bare. Ursus and Gwynplaine wore men's jackets, and, like sailors on board of a man of war, great loose trousers. Gwynplaine had, besides for his work and for his feats of strength, round his neck and over his shoulders, an esclavine of leather. He took charge of the horses. Ursus and Homo took charge of each other. Dea, being used to the green box, came and went in the interior of the wheeled house, with almost as much ease and certainty as those who saw. The eye which could penetrate within this structure and its internal arrangements might have perceived in a corner, fastened to the planks, and immovable on its 4 wheels, the old huts of Ursus, placed on half-pay, allowed to rust, and from thenceforth dispensed the labor of rolling as Ursus was relieved from the labor of drawing it. This hut, in a corner at the back, to the right of the door, served as bedchamber and dressing-room to Ursus and Gwynplaine. It now contained 2 beds. In the opposite corner was the kitchen. The arrangement of a vessel was not more precise and concise than that of the interior of the green box. Everything within it was in its place, arranged, foreseen, and intended. The caravan was divided into 3 compartments, partitioned from each other. These communicated by open spaces without doors. A piece of stuff fell between them and answered the purpose of concealment. The compartment behind belonged to the men, the compartment in front to the women. The compartment in the middle separating the 2 sexes was the stage. The instruments of the orchestra and the properties were kept in the kitchen. A loft under the arch of the roof contained the scenes, and on opening a trap door, lamps appeared, producing wonders of light. Ursus was the poet of these magical representations. He wrote the pieces. He had a diversity of talents. He was clever at sleight of hand. Besides the voices he imitated, he produced all sorts of unexpected things. Shocks of light and darkness, spontaneous formations of figures or words as he willed on the partition, vanishing figures in chiaroscuro, strange things amidst which he seemed to meditate, unmindful of the crowd who marveled at him. One day, Gwynplaine said to him, "Father, you look like a sorcerer." And Ursus replied, "Then I look perhaps like what I am." Oh. The green box, built on a clear model of Ursus's, contained this refinement of ingenuity, that between the fore and hind wheels the central panel of the left side turned on hinges by the aid of chains and pulleys, and could be let down at will like a drawbridge. As it dropped, it set at liberty 3 legs on hinges which supported the panel when let down, and which placed themselves straight on the ground like the legs of a table, and supported it above the earth like a platform. This exposed the stage, which was thus enlarged by the platform in front. This opening looked for all the world like a mouth of hell. In the words of the itinerant Puritan preachers who turned away from it with horror, it was, perhaps, for some such pious invention that Solon kicked out Thespis. For all that Thespis has lasted much longer than is generally believed, the traveling theatre is still in existence. It was on those stages on wheels that, in the 16th and 17th centuries, they performed in England the ballets and dances of Amner and Pilkington in France, the pastorals of Gilbert Collin in Flanders, at the annual fairs, the double choruses of Clement called Non Papa, in Germany the Adam and Eve of Thales, and in Italy the Venetian exhibitions of Animutia and Caphosis, the Sylvae of Gesualdo, the Prince of Venosa, the Satyr of Laura Guidiccioni, the Despair of Philine, the Death of Ugolina by Vincent Galileo, father of the astronomer, which Vincent Galileo sang his own music and accompanied himself on his own viol da gamba, as well as all the first attempts of the Italian opera which, from 1580, substituted free inspiration for the madrigal style. The chariot, of the color of hope, which carried Ursus, Gwynplaine, and their fortunes, and in front of which Phoebe and Venus trumpeted like figures of fame, played its part of this grand bohemian and literary brotherhood. Thespis would no more have disowned Ursus than Congrio would have disowned Gwynplaine. Arrived at open spaces in towns or villages, Ursus, in the intervals between the two-twoing of Phoebe and Venus, gave instructive revelations as to the trumpetings. "This symphony is Gregorian," he would exclaim. "Citizens and townsmen, the Gregorian form of worship. This great progress is opposed in Italy to the ambrosial ritual, and in Spain to the Mozarabic ceremony and has achieved its triumph over them with difficulty. After which, the green box drew up in some places chosen by Ursus, and evening having fallen, and the panel stage having been let down, the theatre opened, and the performance began. The scene of the green box represented a landscape painted by Ursus, and as he did not know how to paint, it represented a cavern just as well as a landscape. The curtain, which we call drop nowadays, was a checked silk with squares of contrasted colors. The public stood without in the street, in the fair, forming a semicircle round the stage, exposed to the sun and the showers, an arrangement which made rain less desirable for theaters in those days than now. When they could, they acted in an inn-yard, on which occasions the windows of the different stories made rows of boxes for the spectators. The theatre was thus more enclosed, and the audience a more paying one. Ursus was in everything, in the piece, in the company, in the kitchen, in the orchestra. Venus beat the drum, and handled the sticks with great dexterity. Phoebe played on the marachi, a kind of guitar. The wolf had been promoted to a utility gentleman, and played, as occasion required, his little parts. Often when they appeared side by side on the stage, Ursus with his tightly laced bear's skin, the wolf with his wolf's skin fitted still better. No one could tell which was the beast. This flattered Ursus. End of chapter 8. Okay, so they are now traveling performers, which I love. So there's Gwynplaine and Dea, and Ursus and the wolf. And then they've added 2 women who are, actors, but also performer or musicians, and also like traveling around and like helping them and whatever. And then 2 horses. Very exciting. That's fun. That's fun. Chapter 9. Absurdities which folks without taste call poetry. The pieces written by Ursus were interludes, a kind of composition out of fashion nowadays. One of these pieces, which has not come down to us, was entitled Ursus Rursus. It is probable that he played the principal part himself. A pretended exit, followed by a reappearance, was apparently its praiseworthy and sober subject. The titles of the interludes of Ursus were sometimes Latin, as we have seen, and the poetry frequently Spanish. The Spanish verses written by Ursus were rhymed, as was nearly all the Castilian poetry of that period. This did not puzzle the people. Spanish was then a familiar language, and the English sailors spoke Castilian even as the Roman sailors spoke Carthaginian. There we go. Hooked on phonics, baby. Moreover, at a theatrical representation, as at Mass, Latin, or any other language unknown to the audience, is by no means a subject of care with them. They get out of the dilemma by adapting to the sounds familiar words. Our old Gallic France was particularly prone to this manner of being devout. At church, under cover of an immolatus, the faithful chanted, "I will make merry," and under Sanctus, "Kiss me sweet." The Council of Trent was required to put an end to these familiarities. Ursus had composed expressly for Gwynplaine an interlude, with which he was well pleased. It was his best work. He had thrown his whole soul into it. To give the sum of all one's talents in the production is the greatest triumph that anyone can achieve. The toad which produces a toad achieves a grand success. You doubt it? Try, then, to do as much. Ursus had carefully polished this interlude. This Bears Club was entitled Chaos Vanquished. Here it was. A night scene. When the curtain drew up, the crowd, massed across the green box, saw nothing but blackness. In this blackness, three confused forms moved in the reptile state: wolf, a bear, and a man. The wolf acted the wolf, Ursus, the bear, Gwynplaine, the man. The wolf and the bear represented the ferocious forces of nature, unreasoning hunger and savage ignorance. Both rushed on Gwynplaine. It was chaos combating man. No face could be distinguished. Gwynplaine fought enfolded in a winding sheet, and his face was covered by his thickly falling locks. All else was shadow. The bear growled, the wolf gnashed his teeth, the man cried out. The man was down, the beasts overwhelmed him. He cried for aid and succor. He hurled to the unknown in agonized appeal. He gave a death rattle. To witness this agony of the prostrate man, now scarcely distinguished from the brutes, was appalling. The crowd looked on breathless. In 1 minute more, the wild beasts would triumph and chaos reabsorb man. A struggle, cries, howlings. Then, all at once, silence. A song in the shadows. A breath had passed, and they heard a voice. Mysterious music floated, accompanying this chant of the invisible, and suddenly, none knowing whence or how, a white apparition arose. This apparition was a light. This light was a woman. This woman was a spirit. Dea, calm, fair, beautiful, formidable in her serenity and sweetness, appeared in the center of a luminous mist, a profile of brightness in a dawn. She was a voice light, deep, indescribable. She sang in the newborn light. She, invisible, made visible. They thought that they heard the hymn of an angel or the song of a bird. At this apparition, the man, starting up in his ecstasy, struck the beasts with his fists and overthrew them. Then the vision, gliding along in the manner difficult to understand, and therefore the more admired, sang these words in Spanish, sufficiently pure for the English sailors who were present. Ora llora de palabra, nace razón, de luz el son. And there's a footnote, and it says, pray, weep, reason is born of the word, song creates light. Then, looking down as if she saw a gulf beneath, she went on. Noche, quítate de allí, el alba canta hayali. Something like that. And it says, a night away, the dawn sings halali. As she sang, the man raised himself by degrees. Instead of lying, he was now kneeling, his hands elevated towards the vision, his knees resting on the beasts, which lay motionless as if thunder-stricken. She continued, turning towards him, Es menester a cielos ir, y tú que llorabas reír. And it says, thou must go to heaven and smile, thou that weepest. And approaching him with the majesty of a star, she added, Gebra barzón, deja monstruo a tu negro capa razón. And it says, break the yoke, throw off, monster, thy dark clothing. And she put hot hand on his brow. Then another voice arose, deeper, and consequently still sweeter, a voice broken and enwrapped with gravity both tender and wild. It was the human chant responding to the chant of the stars. Gwynplaine, still in obscurity, his head under Dea's hand and kneeling on the vanquished bear and wolf, sang, "O ven ama, eres alma, soy corazon." It says, "O come and love, thou art soul, I am heart." And suddenly from the shadow a ray of light fell upon Gwynplaine. Then, through the darkness, was the monster full exposed. To describe the commotion of the crowd is impossible. A sun of laughter rising, such was the effect. Laughter springs from unexpected causes, and nothing could be more unexpected than this termination. Never was sensation comparable to that produced by the ray of light striking on that mask, at once ludicrous and terrible. They laughed all round his laugh, everywhere, above, below, behind, before, at the uttermost distance. Men, women, old grey heads, rosy-faced children, the good, the wicked, the sad, everybody. And even in the streets the passers-by who could see nothing, hearing the laughter, laughed also. The laughter ended in clapping of hands and stamping of feet. The curtain dropped. Gwynplaine was recalled with frenzy, hence an immense success. Have you seen Chaos vanquished? Gwynplaine was run after. The listless came to laugh. The melancholy came to laugh. Evil conscience came to laugh. A laugh so irresistible that it seemed almost an epidemic. But there is a pestilence from which men do not fly, and that is the contagion of joy. The success, it must be admitted, did not rise higher than the populace. A great crowd means a crowd of nobodies. Chaos vanquished could be seen for a penny. Fashionable people never go where the price of admission is a penny. Ursus thought a good deal of his work, which he had brooded over for a long time. "It is in the style of one Shakespeare," he said modestly. The juxtaposition of Dea added to the indescribable effect produced by Gwynplaine. Her white face by the side of the gnome represented what might have been called divine astonishment. The audience regarded Dea with a sort of mysterious anxiety. She had in her aspect the dignity of a virgin and of a priestess, not knowing man and knowing God. They saw that she was blind, and felt that she could see. She seemed to stand on the threshold of the supernatural. The light that beamed on her seemed half earthly and half heavenly. She had come to work on earth, and to work as heaven works, in the radiance of morning. Finding a hydra, she formed a soul. She seemed like a creative power, satisfied but astonished at the power of her creation. And the audience fancied that they could see in the divine surprises of that face desire of the cause and wonder at the result. They felt that she loved this monster. Did she know that he was one? Yes, since she touched him. No, since she accepted him. This depth of night and this glory of day united formed in the mind of the spectator a chiaroscuro in which appeared endless perspectives. How much divinity exists in the germ, in what manner the penetration of the soul into matter is accomplished, how the solar ray is in umbilical cord, how the disfigured is transfigured, how the deformed becomes heavenly, all these glimpses of mysteries added in almost cosmical emotion to the convulsion hilarity produced by Gwynplaine. Without going too deep, for spectators do not like the fatigue of seeking below the surface, something more was understood than was perceived, and this strange spectacle had the transparency of an avatar. As to Dea, what she felt cannot be expressed by human words. She knew that she was in the midst of a crowd, and knew not what a crowd was. She heard a murmur. That was all. For her the crowd was but a breath. Generations are passing breaths. Man respires, aspires, and expires. In that crowd, Dea felt herself alone, and shuddering as one hanging over a precipice. Suddenly, in this trouble of innocence is distress, prompt to accuse the unknown, in her dread of a possible fall, Dea, serene notwithstanding, and superior to the vague agonies of peril, but inwardly shuddering at her isolation, found confidence and support. She had seized her thread of safety in the universe of shadows. She put her hand on the powerful head of Gwynplaine. Joy unspeakable. She placed her rosy fingers on his forest of crisp hair. Wool, when touched, gives an impression of softness. Dea touched a lamb which she knew to be a lion. Her whole heart poured out in ineffable love. She felt out of danger. She had found her savior. The public believed that they saw the contrary. To the spectators, the being loved was Gwynplaine, and the savior was Dea. What matters, thought Ursus, to whom the heart of Dea was visible. And Dea, reassured, consoled, and delighted, adored the angel whilst the people contemplated the monster, and endured, fascinated herself as well, though in the opposite sense, that dread Promethean laugh. True love is never weary. Being all soul, it cannot cool. A brazier comes to be full of cinders, not so a star. Her exquisite impressions were renewed every evening for Dea, and she was ready to weep with tenderness whilst the audience was in convulsions of laughter. Those around her were but joyful. She was happy. The sensation of gaiety due to the sudden shock caused by the rictus of Gwynplaine was evidently not intended by Ursus. He would have preferred more smiles and less laughter, and more of a literary triumph. But success consoles. He reconciled himself every morning to his excessive triumph, as he counted how many shillings the piles of farthings made, and how many pounds the piles of shillings, and besides, he said, after all, when the laugh had passed, chaos vanquished, would be found in the depths of their minds, and something of it would remain there. Perhaps he was not altogether wrong. The foundations of a work settled down in the mind of the public. The truth is, that the populace, attentive to the wolf, the bear, the man, then to the music, to the howlings governed by harmony, to the night dissipated by dawn, to the chant releasing the light, accepted with a confused, dull sympathy, and with a certain emotional respect, the dramatic poem of chaos vanquished. The victory of spirit over matter, ending with the joy of man. Such were the vulgar pleasures of the people. They sufficed them. The people had not the means of going to the noble matches of the gentry, and could not, like lords and gentlemen, be 1,000 guineas on Helmscale against Phelim Madone. That's a nice little tie-in. So that's the end of the chapter. So Helmscale and Phelim were the boxers that we left Hosiana and Lord David. Those were the two boxers that they went to go see. So that's a nice, like, a full circle tie-in. That's cool. Okay, so that was the end of chapter 9. This chapter, we get a look into one of Ursus's performances. And we have Ursus playing a bear, the wolf playing the wolf, and Gwynplaine playing a man. And what happens in this play is the wolf and the bear are attacking the man, and you can't see the man wearing a hood, lots of dark clothes, and hair in the face, all that sort of thing. and they're attacking the man. The man is down on his luck, and then an angel comes out, the angel being Dea, and she's singing about hope and love and all of these things, and Gwynplaine rises, defeats both of the animals, and then reveals his face, and everybody starts laughing, which isn't the intention. And there's also a mention that people laugh for a variety of different reasons. Like, even just thinking, like, in your life, like, people laugh when they're uncomfortable, when they're nervous, when things are funny, when they don't really know how to respond to things. Like, that's oftentimes like a coping thing. So, interesting. Interesting. And that's the play that or the performance that they're doing right now. And Ursus is like, it is of Shakespeare, which I love the confidence, Ursus. Love it. All right. Chapter 10. The outsider's view of men and things. Man has a notion of revenging himself on that which pleases him, hence the contempt felt for the comedian. This being charms me, diverts, distracts, teaches, enchants, consoles me, flings me into an ideal world, is agreeable and useful to me. What evil can I do him in return? Humiliate him. Disdain is a blow from afar. Let us strike the blow. He pleases me, therefore he is vile. He serves me, therefore I hate him. Where can I find a stone to throw at him? Priest, give me yours. Philosopher, give me yours. Bossuet, excommunicate him. Rosset, Ros, Rosseo, no idea. Apologies. Insult him. Orator, spit the pebbles from your mouth at him. Bear, fling your stone. Cast, let us cast stones at the tree, hit the fruit, and eat it. Bravo! And down with him. To repeat poverty is to be infected with the plague. Wretched play actor, we will put him in the pillory for his success. Let him follow up his triumph with our hisses. Let him collect a crowd and create a solitude. Thus it is that the wealthy, termed the higher classes, have invented for the actor that form of isolation, applause. The crowd is less brutal. They neither hated nor despised Gwynplaine. Only the meanest caulker of the meanest crew of the meanest merchantman anchored in the meanest English seaport considered himself immeasurably superior to this amuser of the scum, and believed that a caulker is as superior to an actor as a lord is to a caulker. Gwynplaine was, therefore, like all comedians, applauded and kept at a distance. Truly, all success in this world is a crime and must be expiated. He who obtains the medal has to take its revenge side as its reverse side as well. He who obtains the medal has to take its reverse side as well. For Gwynplaine there was no reverse. In this sense, both sides of his medal pleased him. He was satisfied with the applause, and content with the isolation. In applause he was rich, in isolation happy. To be rich in his low estate means to be no longer wretchedly poor, to have neither holes in his clothes, nor cold at his hearth, nor emptiness in his stomach. It is to eat when hungry and drink when thirsty. It is to have everything necessary, including a penny for a beggar. This indigent wealth, enough for liberty, was possessed by Gwynplaine. So far as his soul was concerned, he was opulent. He had love. What more could he want? Nothing. You may think that he had the You may think that had the offer been made to him to remove his deformity, he would have grasped at it. Yet he would have refused it emphatically. What? To throw off his mask and have his former face restored, to be the creature he had perchance been created, handsome and charming? No, he would never have consented to it, for what would he have to support Dea? What would have become of that poor child, the sweet blind girl who loved him? Without his rictus, which made him a clown without parallel, he would have been a mountebank like any other, a common athlete, a picker-up of pence from the chinks of the pavement, and Dea would perhaps not have had bread every day. It was with deep and tender pride that he felt himself the protector of the helpless and heavenly creature. Night, solitude, nakedness, weakness, ignorance, hunger and thirst, 7 yawning jaws of misery, were raised around her, and he was the St. George fighting the dragon. He triumphed over poverty. How? By his deformity. By his deformity he was useful, helpful, victorious, great. He had but to show himself, and money poured in. He was a master of crowds, the sovereign of the mob. He could do everything for Dea. Her wants he foresaw, her desires, her tastes, her fancies, in the limited sphere in which wishes are possible to the blind, he fulfilled. Gwynplaine and Dea were, as we have already shown, providence to each other. He felt himself raised on her wings. She felt herself carried in his arms. To protect the being who loves you, to give what she requires to her who shines on you as your star. Can anything be sweeter? Gwynplaine possessed this supreme happiness, and he owed it to his deformity. His deformity had raised him above all. By it he had gained the means of life for himself and others. By it he had gained independence, liberty, celebrity, internal satisfaction, and pride. In his deformity he was inaccessible. The fates could do nothing beyond this blow in which they had spent their whole force, and which he had turned into a triumph. This lowest depth of misfortune had become the summit of Elysium. Gwynplaine was imprisoned in his deformity, but with Dea. And this was, as we have already said, to live in a dungeon of paradise. A wall stood between them and the living world. So much the better. This wall protected as well as enclosed them. What could affect Dea? What could affect Gwynplaine with such a fortress around them? To take from him his success was impossible. They would have had to deprive him of his face, take from him his love. Impossible. Dea could not see him. The blindness of Dea was divinely incurable. What harm did his deformity do Gwynplaine? None. What advantage did it give him? Every advantage. He was beloved, notwithstanding its horror, and perhaps for that very cause. Infirmity and deformity had by instinct been drawn towards and coupled with each other. To be beloved, is not that everything? Gwynplaine thought of his disfigurement only with gratitude. He was blessed in the stigma. With joy he felt that it was irremediable and eternal. What a blessing that it was so. While there were highways and fairgrounds and journeys to take, the people below and the sky above, they would be sure to live. Dea would want nothing, and they should have love. Gwynplaine would not have changed faces with Apollo. To be a monster was his form of happiness. Thus, as we have said before, destiny had given him all, even to overflowing. He who had been rejected had been preferred. He was so happy that he felt compassion for the men around him. He pitied the rest of the world. It was, besides, his instinct to look about him, because no one is always consistent, and a man's nature is not always theoretic. He was delighted to live within an enclosure, but from time to time he lifted his head above the wall. Then he retreated again with more joy into his loneliness with Dea, having drawn his comparisons. What did he see around him? What were those living creatures of which his wandering life showed him so many specimens, changed every day? Always new crowds, always the same multitude, ever new faces, ever the same miseries, a jumble of ruins. Every evening, every phase of social misfortune came and encircled his happiness. The green box was popular. Low prices attract the low classes. Those who came there were weak, the poor, the little. They rushed to Gwynplaine as they rushed to gin. They came to buy a pennyworth of forgetfulness. From the height of his platform, Gwynplaine passed those wretched people in review. His spirit was enwrapped in the contemplation of every succeeding apparition of widespread misery. The physiognomy of man is modeled by conscience and by the tenor of life, and is the result of a crowd of mysterious excavations. There is never a suffering, not an anger, not a shame, not a despair, of which Gwynplaine did not see the wrinkle. The mouths of those children had not eaten. That man was a father, that woman a mother, and behind them their families might be guessed to be on the road to ruin. There was a face already marked by vice on the threshold of crime, and the reasons were plain: ignorance and indigence. Another showed the stamp of original goodness, obliterated by social pressure and turned to hate. On the face of an old woman he saw starvation, on that of a girl, prostitution. The same fact, and although the girl had the resource of her youth, all the sadder for that. In the crowd were arms without tools. The workers asked only for work, but the work was wanting. Sometimes a soldier came and seated himself by the workmen, sometimes a wounded pensioner, and Gwynplaine saw the spectre of war. Here Gwynplaine read want of work, there man-farming, slavery. On certain brows he saw an indescribable ebbing back towards animalism, and that slow return of man to beast, produced on those below by the dull pressure of the happiness of those above. There was a break in the gloom for Gwynplaine. He and Dea had a loophole of happiness. The rest was damnation. Gwynplaine felt above him the thoughtless trampling of the powerful, the rich, the magnificent, the great, the elect of chance. Below he saw the pale faces of the disinherited. He saw himself and Dea, with their little happiness, so great to themselves between two worlds. That which was above went and came, free, joyous, dancing, trampling underfoot. Above him the world which treads, below the world which is trodden upon. It is a fatal fact, and one indicating a profound social evil, that light should crush the shadow. Gwynplaine thoroughly grasped this dark evil. What a destiny so reptile! Shall a man drag himself thus along with such adherence to dust and corruption, with such vicious tastes, such an abdication of right, or such abjectness that one feels inclined to crush him underfoot? Of what butterfly is then this earthly life the grub? What, in the crowd which hungers and which denies everyone and before all the questions of crime and shame, the inflexibility of the law-producing laxity of conscience? Is there no child that grows but to be stunted, no virgin but matures for sin, no rose that blooms but for the slime of the snail? His eyes at times sought everywhere with the curiosity of emotion, to probe the depths of that darkness in which there dies away so many useless efforts, and in which there struggled so much weariness, families devoured by society, morals tortured by the laws, wounds gangrened by penalties, poverty gnawed by taxes, wrecked intelligence swallowed up by ignorance, rafts in distress, alive with the famished, feuds, dearth, death rattles, cries, disappearances. He felt the vague oppression of a keen, universal suffering. He saw the vision of the foaming wave of misery dashing over the crowd of humanity. He was safe in port himself, as he watched the wreck around him. Sometimes he laid his disfigured head in his hands and dreamed. What folly to be happy! How one dreams! Ideas were born within him. Absurd notions crossed his brain. Because formerly he had succored an infant, he felt a ridiculous desire to succor the whole world. The mists of reverie sometimes obscured his individuality, and he lost his ideas of proportion so far as to ask himself the question, what can be done for the poor? Sometimes he was so absorbed in his subject as to express it aloud. Then Ursus shrugged his shoulders and looked at him fixedly. Gwynplaine continued his reverie. Oh, were I powerful, would I not aid the wretched? But what am I? An atom. What can I do? Nothing. He was mistaken. He was able to do a great deal for the wretched. He could make them laugh. And, as we have said, to make people laugh is to make them forget. What a benefactor on earth he is, who can bestow forgetfulness. That is the end of chapter 10. I really liked this last chapter. Okay, so we have Gwynplaine, who, as he's performing and as he's traveling around, is just seeing the lower class and seeing how people are torn apart by war, both literally and figuratively, mentally, all of those, in every aspect that war can tear a person apart. And because their shows are only a penny, only the poor are being attracted to this. And so he's getting this worldview and seeing this suffering and really wishing that he could change something, but he doesn't have that power to change anything or to relieve any of their sadness or any of their their misfortunes. But something that he can do is make them laugh, which is a good thing, but also sad because they're not really laughing with him. They're laughing because his face has been disfigured. But if he had the opportunity to change his face back, would he do it? Absolutely not. Why? Because it would leave Dea alone. And they have this wall around them that protects them from the rest of the world and the world from them. And if he didn't have that, then they wouldn't be on the same level. So no, he would never do that. He's going to keep his face the way that it is. And it's not so bad, he's found out. He kind of likes that he's able to make people laugh, even if his face is not the intention of making people laugh, or his role is not the intention of making people laugh. As Ursus has stated, the role that he was playing in the play wasn't intended for laughter. It was more for just a little bit of levity. Super dark, but really cool, and a lot of commentary and things, for lack of a better word, being stated here. And you can absolutely see why Victor Hugo was excommunicated from his country. He wrote this being excommunicated, shunned from his country because of his other two books, which when I read that, didn't explicitly say what books, but his previous books were Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which I have not read, but I am assuming are very pointed. I mean, I've seen the play Les Mis, I've seen the musical live and the movie version. And yeah, I can see why he might be excommunicated. And also, this book definitely has very strong opinions, and it is not a surprise at all that like his country is like, I think that you should not do this here. Yes, we'll catch you next stream. It'll be great. Yeah, so it feels like we're just getting the motion. Like the groundwork has all been laid out of who, what, where, when, everything like that. And now it feels like, okay, Gwynplaine and Dea are of age where they can make an impact in society. And here we go. In the words of Mario, let's go. So I'm very excited to see what happens. I have not read this book before, or seen any not parodies, any oh my gosh, words are so hard for me today. Oh man. Adaptations. There we go. Have not seen any adaptations. So it's all new for me, but I'm super enjoying it, really liking it. I hope you are as well. The writing is beautiful, which I know I say that every time, but it is true every time. And it feels like every time there's like little nuggets that I'm like, I want to try. I want to try to remember that. But clearly I can't because I can't even remember how to say a specific word that we've seen 3 times today. But that's going to be it for tonight. Thank you all so, so much for being here. It is a pleasure, as always. We'll pick up right where we left off next time. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you, and I 1000% appreciate your support. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very, very soon.